for folks who were here last week, what an incredible amount of history has been made in just a week's time. I can't tell you how excited I am to have this discussion about the rebellion that's sweeping the country right now, and look at the historical roots of it and where it might go and what we need to demand. And I'm just so thrilled to get to be in conversation today with Dr. Keisha Blain. So I'm very excited to get this rolling, but before we do, I just want to say some words about how today is going to work. Some of you are joining us for the first time, and some of you have participated in one or each of our sessions over the last 5 weeks. I'm so honored to get to help host this series, and it's incredible that Professor Jean Theo Harris helped to launch this whole series of people's history lessons. And I'm a high school teacher here in Seattle, and I'm an editor with Rethinking Schools, and we coordinate the Zen Education Project along with Teaching for Change. So the Zen Education Project is hosting this session today, and it offers free downloadable lesson plans that many of you have probably used in your middle and high school classrooms from the Zen Education Project website. I highly recommend you go to the website and find lessons that relate to the things that you're teaching. And particularly, we offer a lot of lessons that address the themes of this session here today on the roots of the rebellion. We have lessons on Reconstruction, on the Tulsa Massacre, on redlining, on reparations, on the fight for voting rights, and really so much more. There it is on your screen. Go to zeneducationproject.org and check out all the teaching materials. It's made my classroom so much stronger, my pedagogy so much more relevant to my kids' lives. So as well, before I begin my conversation with Dr. Keisha N. Blain, we want to find out who is in the room and go through our plans for our time together. We are going to do a quick poll to find out how many teachers and librarians, how many teacher, educator, historians, parents, students, labor, or community organizers, educators of all kind are in the room with us. And many of you have multiple roles, so then just pick the primary role that you have and mark that down. So educator Sierra Kaler Jones just posted that poll, so you can respond to it here. All right, hopefully you see it on the screen right now. Excellent. So throughout the session, we want you to use the chat box. You can post questions. You can post comments, resources if you have ideas related to the topics we're talking about. And then our guest speaker will read your questions, and we can try to get to them after the breakout groups, and then we'll do a short evaluation at the end. So here we're seeing the results of the polls. Excellent. 55% of us here on the Zoom call today are educators, 10% students. Yay for the young people who are leading the rebellion. Primary family caregivers, we have 1%, librarians, 1%, teacher educators, 13%, historians, 7%, labor community organizers, 4%, and other 10%. Excellent. Thank you all for being with us today. So we're now ready to start our conversation. And after about 20 minutes, we'll pause so that you can meet each other in small groups. It's a real important opportunity we have with these Friday calls to break into small classrooms and discuss the issues that we talked about. And then you get to come back at the end and ask any questions, okay? So I'm really happy to introduce you all today to Dr. Keisha N. Blain, an award-winning historian of the 20th century United States, associate professor, and so much so much more. I'm really, yes, definitely get the book, Set the World on Fire, The Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom. I highly recommend folks check out her work. If you haven't seen some of her recent articles as well in the Washington Post, you have to check that out. She is also associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, the president of the African American Intellectual History Society. And Blain is the author of the book that you just saw on the screen. So we're going to have a rich dialogue about this rebellion that is happening in the streets near you, and where it really came from. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here together. I know we're all in different places and different spaces, but it certainly feels like a community, and it's good that we have this opportunity to have a conversation. As Jesse noted, if you do have questions and comments, please indicate those questions and comments in the chat box, and I'll try my best to follow along. I'm really just hoping that I can offer some insights and resources for all of you, but I do see this as a conversation, and so if you ever have an idea, thought, something that I've said that makes you think of something else that you have found effective in the classroom, please do share, and hopefully we can share it. We can get all this information out to everyone on the call via the website afterward. So thank you for having me.
It's really an honor to be in dialogue with you today, to welcome you to this community. And what I love about this community is it reaches so many more people, right? All the educators on this meeting then go and share this information with students, and we're really transforming classrooms and schools around the country. So we're really lucky to get to learn from your research and insights. And I just want to start by saying that there have been so many low moments for me, and some moments of deep trauma, really, for me and for millions of others around the world, as we learned of the deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others in our own local communities that people have never heard of, right? But I have to say also that today my heart is really just singing. I think after having been in the streets with so many young people yesterday who were chanting defund the police, and they were just absolutely determined. You could see it on their faces. They knew they were going to win in this struggle against police violence and institutional racism. And the size and scope of this rebellion is just truly breathtaking. So I wonder if you have a favorite moment or a sign or a speech from the uprisings around the globe in the last few days, and how would you compare this uprising to others throughout history?
Yeah, so one of the things that caught my attention in the last few days has been people sharing videos from different parts of the globe. One video caught my attention in particular, and that was a group of activists walking through Trafalgar Square, which is in London. And I stopped for a moment and looked at it and immediately thought about my own work and the work that I've done in Set the World on Fire. And in chapter 5, I briefly describe a scene of Amy Ashwood Garvey, who at the time was living in London. She got together with several other Black activists, revolutionary Black activists, in 1935, and they were marching through the same square, and they were calling out colonialism. And of course, as you know, those of you who you've mentioned teach world history immediately know the significance of 35 for so many things, but in particular in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. And that's a moment where people across the Black diaspora are coming together in a similar vein as we're coming together now, and denouncing colonialism, denouncing white supremacy, and saying this is terrible, this needs to stop, and also extending a hand of support and solidarity to Ethiopians. And so it was great then to see a video circulating, and it just brought me right back to that scene that I talk about in chapter 5, And perhaps in that image of in and of itself, that might speak to the possibilities of where this movement, I think, will be headed. I think we're certainly seeing uprisings across the country, and I think we'll see more and more uprisings, more and more people standing up in solidarity with the struggle for freedom in the United States. We'll see that taking place. We'll see people standing up in support in various parts of the globe, and that's key, because if we're not careful, we fall into a trap of imagining that racism or white supremacy is an American problem, and an American problem alone. But certainly we know better. We understand that it's a global issue, so we have to think of ways to tackle it globally. So the other thing too, in looking at what's taking place today, immediately I think about the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And it's tough because I certainly don't want to suggest that every single thing that's happening today is the same. I think that the question is really about the threads, the similarities, the commonalities that we see, whether it's even just thematically the topic of civil rights. I keep trying to reiterate the point to everyone that when we talk about police violence in the United States today, it is not divorced from a conversation of civil rights in the United States. It certainly is very much a part of the discussion. It has to be. How can you have citizenship rights? How can you have civil rights, political rights, or even human rights if you can't, as a Black person, walk the streets freely, if you can't have an encounter with the police that could potentially, if you're going to have an encounter with the police that could potentially lead to your death, to your killing. So all of these things are connected, and I think I reflect on the 1960s and 1970s because in a similar way, people just came together collectively, outraged by what was going on, and trying to figure out ways to work together to bring about the change they wanted to see.
No doubt. No doubt. And I think a lot of the educators that are in this forum with us right now have been talking to their students about these issues for some time. I'm just curious about the folks who are with us. I wonder how many of you have been teaching for Black lives, right? And or are recommitting to doing so. So we have a poll that just went up, and I'm curious about the results here, right? So you can check as many as apply to you, right? I have used the following lessons or resources, right? So Zinn Education Project lessons on Reconstruction, voting rights or redlining, or about SNCC and the Panthers and COINTELPRO, or Teaching for Black Lives, the book I helped to edit. Have you used that, or other lessons or resources on institutional racism? Or maybe that you're just coming here for the first time because you really haven't been teaching for Black lives yet, and you realize in this moment, in this rebellion, that you need to, that you have to right now. And so you're looking for resources. So please fill out this poll as we continue the discussion. All right. So I want to share with you one of my favorite moments from this rebellion in the last few days, if that's all right. And it was when Women's March organizer and activist Tamika Mallory told protesters in Minneapolis at one of the large rallies there, she said, quote, "America has looted Black people. America has looted the Native Americans when they first came here. Looting is what you do. We learned it from you. We learned violence from you. If you want us to do better, then damn it, you do better." And that really struck me. And I think her statement was just so powerful, and it went viral around the world. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about the significance of Black women leaders in this movement today and throughout history.
Absolutely. I think, and I remember seeing that video too, just circulating on social media. And it was a just powerful moment to see Tamika Mallory speaking before crowds of people. And it brought me back to different moments in history, and not only moments where women are standing in front of large audiences, but also moments where women are doing the work, sometimes quietly, quote unquote, behind the scenes, out of the purview of the spotlight. And I think immediately of someone like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was someone who, of course, everyone knows about Ida B. Wells. We talk about Ida B. Wells even recently. Ida B. Wells was just honored with a Pulitzer Prize citation, and we lift up Ida B. Wells as someone who worked tirelessly to challenge lynching in the United States, anti-lynching crusader who worked not only within the US context, but also globally. I also think it's important to emphasize. Ironically, I started off talking about London, but and here I am bringing up the UK again, because Ida B. Wells traveled to the UK in the late 19th century to talk about lynching, to forge collaborations with people there, to figure out strategies to bring an end to it. And Ida B. Wells was someone who, in the moment in which she was doing the kind of work that she was doing, she wasn't always well received. I mean, the reality is, as we know, she had to flee Memphis because white folks are trying to lynch her. So they were trying to kill her for shedding light on the very issue that she was writing about. And this is someone who just toiled and toiled for many years, wrote extensively. And of course, we're in the context, we're talking about teaching. So one of the things that I would even encourage you to do, if you're not already doing it, is think about ways that you can draw upon the writings of Ida B. Wells. So the Red Record, which she published, is now easily available on the internet. Just do a quick search. You can get the full report there. What you might do, depending on the grade that you teach, you might pull parts and pieces of the Red Record, have students read that in conjunction with with contemporary pieces, maybe op-eds for today. The recent op-ed that I wrote, draws a link to lynching, but I'm certainly not the only one to do that. You can look at Isabel Wilkerson's earlier piece, I think in 2015, that draws a parallel to lynching and police violence. So you can use these kinds of texts to get students to start thinking critically and to ask a question, because some people are resistant to calling police killings lynchings, and they're resistant to it because they think that it's not a good practice within the history, because lynchings are uniquely described as a public spectacle, and there are all these facets of it. And I personally don't get caught up in those those little things, because I think that ultimately police killings function the exact same way. So in the end, why dance around the issue? It's a lynching. It was a lynching then, and it's a lynching now. Maybe we've shifted from ordinary citizens to police officers, but in the end, the result is the same, and it is still very public.
And sometimes they do make a public
right
spectacle too, especially when they leave the bodies in the streets for a long time, right?
And we saw that, just, if I'm not mistaken, this week, just a few days ago, there was an incident of someone killed by the police, and I believe just body laid in the street for probably 12 hours, or and so that's why I'm always saying to people, you get caught up in the terminology, but the reality is it's state-sanctioned violence and it's police killings, but it's in this context, and previously it was killings, from individuals, but even sometimes from the police then too. So it's important to draw those connections, I think, for students. And so back to your question about women's leadership, Ida B. Wells is someone who I think is a great person to emphasize in this moment. And I would also throw out someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who I just one of, someone I have found such inspiration from. And I'm writing a book on Hamer now, so I'm just consumed with her writings, and I just can't get enough of Hamer, but and I won't stop talking about her for a while. But Hamer spoke openly about police violence and brutality too, and that's something that I think we don't often emphasize. So if you're teaching, you want to pull those narratives in. You could look at the 1964 speech she gave before the DNC. I believe, so there's actually a very good collection of essays of Fannie Lou Hamer speeches, so you could pull from there. You could just do a Google search and get the transcript and get people to read it, get your students to engage the speech, and maybe even juxtapose what Hamer had to say about police violence in 1964 to what Tamika Mallory had to say in 2020. I mean, that's just, I think, a fascinating way to grapple with the topic and to get students to see like the role of women leading in this. I'm giving national examples of the national context, but you could do the same thing too transnationally, and my work may be useful in your teaching as well as others that center women's activism across the globe.
Wow, I think that might be my next lesson, is Fannie Lou Hamer and pulling quotes and articles from the Red Record as well. That's a brilliant idea. I haven't checked that archive out yet, so thank you for that suggestion. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the history of police as well today. I think many people who were shocked by the behavior of police today, when they see these videos or they see Black people being brutalized, they're only shocked because they've been mistaught about the police. And I had a very personal experience with that in the last few weeks, because my own son is in first grade and he got a worksheet home about 3 weeks ago from a company called Education to the Core. And they sent home a worksheet called Police Protect Us. And the passage there, you can see it, it said, police work very hard to keep us safe. They drive in police cars and solve problems that they see while driving. The police ride on motorcycles, bicycles, and even horses. They solve crimes and help with emergencies. They make sure people are driving safely. They make sure people are following the law. Their jobs are very important. The next time you see a police officer, make sure you thank them for keeping us safe. So then there were several questions on this worksheet. The first said, what are some of the things that police officers do? My son wrote, well, first it says, what kind of transportation? My son wrote cars. Then it said, what are some of the things they do? My son wrote, well, they pepper spray people like my dad, because in 2015, I gave the final speech at a Seattle Martin Luther King Day rally, and it was on my son's 2-year-old birthday. And they pepper sprayed me about a few minutes after I gave that speech, just straight in the face for no reason. So that's been, given him a very different idea of the police, and he immediately saw this assignment for what it was. Because when they said, why do you think police officers' jobs are important, you can see he said their nurses, doctors, and ambulances are important, but not police. And then you see the forum even asked him to say what would be another good title for the story, and he just wrote Police Don't Protect Us, which I think is A+ work if we have to reduce our kids to grades. But I think teachers in this session today are really committed to teaching outside of the textbook in this kind of racist worksheet. And so I hope you can help us today with what they can be teaching about the origins of police, because I think once you know about where they came from, it exposes so much of what we're taught about it. And also if you could tell us more about when and how police forces developed.
Yeah, so I think that assignment is probably reflective of the larger kinds of narratives that we tell, as you note in textbooks, but I would say just mainstream narratives that we like to tell, and that is one particular perspective, right? It's a perspective of a white person. So the us in that story isn't reflective of everyone. It's certainly not reflective of Black people. You certainly could not talk about Black people's experiences in the U.S. Or anywhere and suggest that police are protectors. I mean, this is definitely wishful thinking and the kind of narrative that has ultimately made it possible for us to find ourselves here, where people are surprised, or at least some are surprised, and somehow shocked that everything has been going on for the last few days. Finally came to the surface, but as we all know, this isn't new. And what I think will be useful in this moment as you're teaching about the 2020 uprisings, one of the things that you absolutely have to do is to go back to slavery. You have to talk about slavery you have to talk about slave patrols, and you have to help students draw the connections to recognize that American policing comes out of this context. It comes out of a racist context, a context in which the focus, the purpose of the police, just in the very beginning, was meant to police and control black people's lives, to limit their movement, to make sure that they would be kept oppressed. And that continues. So even after slavery ends with the Civil War, what we see are then the creation of these forces, initially sort of informal groups of white men, but with time, by the period of Reconstruction, certainly more uniformed and organized within cities. And what they're meant to do is function in the same way as slave catchers and function in the same way as slave patrols, which is to now uphold, well, now slavery is an issue, so now upholding Black codes, which ultimately function the same way. I mean, Black codes were meant to uphold white supremacy, as slavery was meant to uphold white supremacy. So as you move throughout the history, by the time you get to the 1960s, it's not at all surprising that police officers are in full resistance to activists who are fighting for civil, and I saw the person's comment to emphasize human rights. Absolutely, I don't think we should ever lose sight of that. The other thing too is when we talk about lynching, which I just referenced earlier with Ida B. Wells, lynching was only able to really thrive across the United States because of the function of the police to support those who were doing lynching, and sometimes to be the actual ones doing the lynching. And you see that in Ida B. Wells's writings. So I think as we're discussing this moment and teaching this moment, I do want to give a book recommendation, which I should have mentioned before. If you're just not as familiar with the history and you just want to figure out ways to teach it. And this is a book called Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas. The author is Sally E. Haddon. This is published by the by Harvard University Press. I can send this link to everyone at the end and make sure you have access to it. But that's just one example. What you might do is maybe just take a close look at that book or other books, and see if either passages you can assign or if there might be primary documents that you may be able to access. Certainly there are countless databases. For example, there are many databases, and I'm happy to follow up if you're not familiar. I can share some databases where you can find ads. So when an enslaved person ran away, the enslaver would post an ad in a local newspaper to try to find that person, and there are databases that are just filled with hundreds of these kinds of ads. And so you could pull those and have students maybe break up into groups to talk about, to write about, and then draw the parallels to see what are the similar kinds of ways that that white people were trying to control Black people's lives and movements in the context of slavery, and then juxtapose that to the current moment with policing. So there are ways I think you can do that. And if you don't want to necessarily go back to slavery, quite frankly, you could focus on the 20th century. You could focus on the 1960s, and still get to the heart of the point, which is that as much as we would like to believe that police officers are meant to protect, that's simply not the case for Black and brown people in this country.
Absolutely. And I should just tell you that worksheet was in the midst of a whole bunch of other worksheets, and the teacher didn't really see it. And I'm proud of my son's teacher because she went and challenged the company when she found out about it, and is right now trying to get them to change or remove it. So that's been a really important struggle. And I love your ideas for how to begin this conversation about the roots of policing and the function and role of police in our society. So that, because too often we get stuck in this bad apple kind of narrative. and we look at the particularly racist police and something they have done. And to me, uh, obviously it's horrifying when there's a particularly racist police officer, but it's not so much about which ones are good and which ones are bad, but what's the role of policing in society? Where did it come from?
Mm-hmm.
What are they there? What are they designed to do? And I'm just so inspired by people who are really getting at the roots now, and talking about how do we defund police and use that wealth, right, to provide social programs, right? We could fund our schools, we could provide trauma counselors. I mean, all the things we could do to support our youth rather than continue with this kind of school to prison pipeline. So those are some great ideas, I think, that we have to begin teaching this history. And I think this moment also demands that we teach about the history of rebellions to police violence as well. So I'm hoping you could talk more about some of the highlights, some of the high moments in the struggles against police violence.
Yes, I believe everyone would have received a copy of just a short article that I wrote on Black women's organizing against police violence and brutality in New York City in the 1980s. And I wanted to circulate that because in as much as we do have to talk about the problem of police violence, police killings, I want to make sure that we're also bringing, in our teaching, the narratives that help students understand the way Black people resisted and continue to resist, the way that Black people stand up to the police. We certainly see that historically much earlier than the 1980s example that I shared. But I shared that example because I thought it was useful within a contemporary moment where many of us are familiar with the mothers of the movement. And so I'm speaking about a group of women, I think I'm off the top of my head about 7 women who were, who are for the most part mothers. But I believe also there's one person's a grandmother, and I think there's even a sister included in the group, but individuals whose lives have been touched, devastated because they lost a loved one to police violence, to police killing. And in 2016 in particular, the Mothers of the Movement were very, very popular in the national dialogues because they were often traveling with at the time Hillary Rodham Clinton, and so we would have seen them in that context speaking out about police violence. So the example that I shared from the 1980s, I think of that as a high moment. And why do I say that? Obviously, it's all of this is within a context in which we see so many terrible cases in New York City. The police killing of Michael Stewart in '83, and the police killing of Edmund Perry, the police killing of Eleanor Bumpers. So all of these things are happening in this moment, but what is powerful, I think, in the narrative is that here you see 2 particular women, Veronica Perry and Mary Bumpers, who come together, and not just by themselves. I mean, other women join the movement too, who come together to try to organize around this issue, to resist, to try to come up with strategies for confronting it, to be very vocal, and what you can tell in their lives, I think for the 2 of them, they were certainly involved in political activism in different ways, leading up to the dreadful moment where they lost their loved one. But that particular moment becomes a turning point, and they sort of turn their grief into political action. We see that, right, in just post 1980s. We see that certainly with Eric Garner's daughter, but also Eric Garner's mother, who I believe we just saw yesterday attending the memorial service of George Floyd. And so I think, in as much as this is a very painful narrative, and we have to point out the problems, and we have to make sure that our students are cognizant of this history, I think we can use these sort of examples to help them see how Black people responded, how Black people came up with strategies to challenge police violence, and so that, you know, in as much as we can talk about the fact that we have, and, you know, are victims within this narrative, we're not just victims in this narrative, that we are agents, you know, agents of change, and we are committed to coming up with strategies to confront these issues. So I think that kind of story is one we might choose to emphasize. And sorry that my headphones are deciding to pop off, but maybe that's an indication it's time for me to stop speaking.
No, thank you. I really like your response there. I'm just reflecting on it because I realize that I haven't really incorporated enough in my teaching about the families organizing for their lost loved ones. And, you know, I work with families here in Seattle who have lost their loved ones. You know, Charlene Elias was a pregnant mother of 3 children when the police entered her apartment and killed her in her own apartment in front of her kids. And we've worked with the family, and the strength of the family is what gives me inspiration to continue doing this work. And so, yes, like, let's teach about the history of family who are not just victims, as you say, but also turn that pain into power and organize and fight back. And thankfully they have. So I have one last question before we move to breakouts, and we're at time, so we're going to have to be somewhat brief. But we can start the conversation about the overlapping crises that are occurring right now, that have produced this rebellion, I think. So we have the COVID pandemic, we have an economic collapse, we have voter suppression, we have this authoritarian in the White House, we have violent policing and structural racism overlapped on top of all of these crises. And so I hope you can just say a word about what caused this uprising and where you hope it goes.
Yeah, so I think for many of us, certainly seeing the video of George Floyd just sparked outrage and frustration, and I think I heard someone describe it just recently as the straw that broke the camel's back, and I think it's very much as part of a larger issue that we've been dealing with. I mean, the heart of the issue is white supremacy. It's structural racism, and then of course here we are in 2020, where we just for the last 3 months have been battling, you know, COVID-19. We're also dealing with the reality. The data reveals this to us clearly, that Black people in particular are contracting the virus and dying from the virus at a significantly higher rate than other racial groups. Then we're in an election year, and we are in a situation where we have someone in the White House who could, as far as I'm concerned, could care less about certainly Black people and brown people in this country. And all of that plus just a range of problems like the ones you mentioned, it just I think all bubbled to the surface, and people had enough. And I know, of course, the mainstream media will focus in on things like destruction of property, you know, like looting, and oftentimes use those as distractions to somehow suggest that we can't even talk about the larger issues here because, look, someone you know, burned something down or someone broke something. But the reality is that even those kinds of expressions are reflective, I think, in the largest sense of the fight for economic justice, that there's so much economic inequality, you know, when people are, and fine, I mean, I think most of us, probably all of us, will say that we're not endorsing acts of violence per se, but think about the kind of symbolism, so to speak, behind someone, you know, breaking, you know, some luxury store. I mean, I think it's far, you know, we see the surface, but we have to go deeper in understanding what it means, you know, to be Black in this country, where you're constantly, you're at the bottom, you know, of the economic ladder. just, just even educational inequality. So it feels like so many things coming together at once and coming together in this moment. The other thing too that I'll just briefly, and I know you said brief, and here I am going on, but the last quick thing that I'll mention is just thinking about, the context of Trump. I was reflecting on earlier moments in our history where we've been at a similar place. I thought about just even 1957 with the Little Rock Nine. I thought about how in Arkansas, Governor, I'm forgetting his name. I think it's Faubus, yes. How he tried to bring in the Arkansas National Guard to block these students from integrating the local high school. And the response to that at the national level was having, President Eisenhower send troops in. So to say, listen, we are going to enforce, the law. We are going to make sure that we enforce the Brown decision of '54. But now we're in a position where we can't even imagine that kind of intervention. Like, we don't even have someone in the White House who will take that step. To the contrary, he'd be the one sending in people to, if you think about this, a similar scenario, he'd be the one sending people to stop the integration of the school. So it's just a very painful and frustrating moment to be in. And I think all of it just came to the surface and people had just had enough. And so they took to the streets, and some people burned some things down and some people did other things. But in the end, I hope that collectively that we stay focused on the fundamental problem here, which, as I said before, is white supremacy. Because we could talk about looting, we could talk about destruction of property, we could talk about 100 different things, but if we don't actually uproot the problem, then we'll find ourselves back here over and over again.
Yes, thank you so much for focusing on us on what's important. Like the great leader here in Seattle, Nikita Oliver, she's been in the streets protesting and organizing for years, and she gave a speech yesterday or the last couple of days just saying, we can buy new cars and new windows, but we can't buy a new George Floyd, and we can't buy a new Breonna Taylor. So we really need to focus on what the real struggle is about: uprooting institutional racism and an economic system that profits off of it as well. So thank you for focusing all of us educators on how we can bring that into our classroom. We're about to break into our little mini classrooms, and then we'll continue the conversation. I just wanted to show that the poll results showed that lots of people are already teaching some incredible thing, teaching for Black lives in many ways. And it looks like 76% now want to increase their use of these anti-racist lessons and teach more about this rebellion than they already are. This is really exciting. So I just want to take a quick moment to talk about the politics of pedagogy behind these breakout rooms. Pedagogically, we know that all learners need processing. They need time to space. They need time and space to reflect and to comment on new knowledge. And politically, our hope is that the new insights that you gain will actually shape how and when you teach, and which I think really means this experience cannot be passive. So the breakout room is a chance for you to begin the process, I think, of applying what you have heard to your own lives and practices. And we will automatically place you in breakout rooms in a moment. If at any time you want to leave and return to the main room, you can always do that. And once in small groups, just go around and introduce yourself and say where you are from. In many groups, there will be a teacher volunteer who will introduce themselves and facilitate. If there isn't one in yours, then we just ask that one of the teachers in the group or someone who's had facilitation experience can just volunteer to do that. And you just have probably even less than 12 minutes now. So please quickly introduce yourself just with your name, where you're from, your role, go around the room and do that, and then open the discussion. And we have a couple main talking points. How did Blain's framing of the discussion help you think about the uprising of the last week and the factors that caused it? And then number two, how, if at all, does the history of policing show up in the curriculum, and what do students need to know and why, and how might we teach this today? All right. So we'll give you a 3-minute warning and then a 30-second alert when it's time to come back to the full group automatically. And then just before we go into our groups, just an equity consideration, please make sure everyone has spoken before you speak again. All right. So we'll see you back soon. Hopefully you all are muted and we can continue. Excellent. I hope you had wonderful discussions about how to apply this to your own classrooms. And I want to share a little bit with you all from my book that I co-edited with Diane Watson and Wayne Au called Teaching for Black Lives. We collected incredible lessons and teaching activities and essays, and most importantly, artwork and poems as well from educators all over the country, and made this volume to help you teach for Black lives, hopefully all the time, but especially in moments like these that demand allowing students to discuss this uprising that's happening. One thing I want to say before I highlight a couple of the lessons in here is that before you dive into teaching for Black lives, you have to build a relationship with all of your students, and especially your Black students. And it's when they know that you care about them that they'll be interested in learning about these lessons first, right? So I think it's so important that I do peace circles in my classroom where we discuss how they're doing, right? We check in about their emotional well-being before class starts, and we have a way to solve problems. If conflicts arise in the classroom, we can bring them to our peace circles. And these are the kind of prerequisites to learning that I think we should be very cognizant of. And then we can get into these lessons. And a couple I want to share with you all today. One is an essay I wrote about student athletes taking a knee to level the playing field. And this is a lesson about, there it is on the screen, about the history of athletes recently moving to use their platforms to highlight police violence and systemic racism. And Kaepernick, of course, brought this to a national scale in a new way. But one of the things I point out in the article is that it was actually the WNBA athletes that first started protesting in a big way that helped inspire Kaepernick to take his stand, especially Black women in the WNBA, and that it was students taking up Kaepernick's protest that I think really helped propel this, because I think if it had only been Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, it would have quickly been forgotten. But when, my high school here in Seattle became the first school in the country to have the entire football team all take a knee, and then the entire marching band took a knee, and all the cheerleaders took a knee, and then it spread to the girls volleyball team and the softball team, and they all took a knee as well, and then schools around the country took a knee. And I think it was the outpouring of support from young people that convinced other professional athletes that if they protested, they would be supported by their community. And then Colin Kaepernick wasn't totally isolated as other athletes joined in the protest. And I think understanding the role that youth played and teaching that history in our classrooms to show that our students can be protagonists in the great struggles that are happening today is so important. I also co-authored this lesson with the great educator Adam Sanchez about what we don't learn about the Black Panther Party but should. And there's another article by Adam Sanchez teaching the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there's a role play in there where you actually reenact a movement meeting of SNCC where you're debating what the organization should focus on in the struggles of the 1960s. And those debates, I think, really help students today think about how they might get organized and what questions they might take up as this rebellion continues to grow. And I'll just end my comments about teaching for Black Lives today by saying that, when I conducted these kind of role plays in my classroom where students take on the questions of maybe the abolitionist movement or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or they become a member of the Black Panther Party and think about the debates that were happening around police violence in the 60s and 70s, they then learn to think as activists do. And I've seen the power of that in my own high school when some of the students who went through a year's class of doing many of these different lessons and teaching activities and role plays then led a mass walkout at my high school to demand more school funding. I think that we are in a new political moment, a new historical moment when youth are on the move, and giving them a little bit of context about other youth throughout history that have made change is just really so important to their ability to make lasting change. So thank you all who are teaching for Black Lives right now. And I hope that we can just end with some final insights from our incredible guest with us here today. And I want to ask about what the role of social media is today in the rebellion. So much of our youth are on social media and are using it to help propel this movement. And I wanted to end with that, but I want to make sure before you answer that people stick around and they fill out the form that'll be in the chat box before you leave, so you can do an evaluation of this session today. All right. So I'm gonna turn it over to you, Keisha. Somebody asked in the chat about the role of social media, so I'd love to hear what you think.
Sure. I think there are several things I would emphasize. I think the first is that, as we all know, social media has been such a powerful tool for organizing. And even now we're seeing that happening within the context of the 2020 uprising. But I was even thinking about it too, just some of even a project I was involved in 2015. I think, as many of you know, I collaborated with Chad Williams and Kadida Williams on the Charleston syllabus. And it started off as a hashtag, right, on Twitter. And it provided a way for educators, certainly the three of us, but not just three of us, educators all over the country to come together to recommend resources, readings that we ultimately put together on a list. You can now find the Charleston syllabus list on the website of the African American Intellectual History Society. And we also put together a book, which you're seeing, the Charleston syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence, which, by the way, I think is, it's always a funny thing when you're trying to, I personally promote, I prefer promoting other people's work than my own, but if you're looking for something else to add to the conversation, you may use the Charleston syllabus in your teaching. The only other thing I would emphasize is just on the one hand, yes, social media is great for organizing, and it has been, I think, an effective strategy, a tool certainly, and a venue for people to come together, for activists to come together. We also have to be mindful that social media is also a potential way for movements to be squashed, for movements to be infiltrated, and as we're now using a platform in this moment that we know thankfully, we haven't had to deal with some of the things that people have experienced with Zoom bombing. But the point is that you don't quite always know who's in the room, right? And you don't know when people are present to be a part of the conversation or simply to surveil for whatever purpose. And so that's just something to keep in mind, is just knowing that it's useful, but there are limitations. And sometimes I think social media should be the first point of contact, but I think oftentimes it's useful to start there, get people together, connected, and then get offline and actually have private conversations, as private as as you can, given the circumstances today. So that's all I'll say. The only quick other thing too that came to mind for teaching, it depends on your it depends on your style of teaching, and also depends on the grade. But you may decide to utilize something like Twitter as part of your teaching. So one of the things that you could do is you come up with a unique hashtag for your class. In the fall, you could ask students to go on Twitter at a particular time. You could have a Twitter chat that either happens, maybe connected to the course you're teaching, or at another time. If you're allowing students to use, laptops in a classroom, you could try a Twitter chat that involves other people. There are other creative ways that you can try to use social media to enhance your teaching, and students may find it to be a lot of fun, something that gets them out of the usual kind of ordinary process of being in a classroom and going over text and so on. I'm happy to talk to anyone about that more if you would like to explore those kinds of possibilities.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Blain. Your insights today, I think, have really inspired me to add to my curriculum. The Charleston curriculum was so powerful, and I think we drew on that for the Black Lives Matter at School curriculum as well. And so laying that groundwork was so important, and just all the insights you shared with us, I'm really thankful for. What a rich conversation we've had today. I hope everyone here has gained a lot from this conversation and will recommit themselves to teaching for Black lives today in this moment, and supporting our youth in changing the world. So I want to thank everyone for being here. We want your feedback on this session, the content and the format. And we've put a link in the chat box so that you can provide that feedback. But before doing the evaluation, please unmute yourself and share your thank yous to each other and to our great.
Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.